Well, friends, we welcome you to another gathering of this experiment in hope that we're carrying on, putting together our class on religion and human transformation with the work of the Gandhi Hamer King Center. And in what has become a part of our ritual, we're going to start with music again. This time, we'd like you to hear the voice of one of our patron saints, Fannie Lou Hamer. This recording was done in 1964, and it was not done exceedingly professionally. We didn't have Brock and Andy around at the time, but you will catch Mrs. Hamer. And that's what we wanted you to do, because these folks who are with us today are in very deep ways related to Mrs. Hamer and her spirit.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine,
I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
everywhere I go, Lord,
I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
light of freedom,
I'm gonna let it shine. I've got the light of freedom. I'm gonna let it shine. I've got the light of freedom. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
Jesus gave it to me now.
I'm gonna let it shine. Jesus gave it to me now. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Jesus gave it to me now. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
Shine, shine, shine.
I'm gonna let it shine. shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. I'm gonna let it shine, all in the jailhouse. I'm gonna let it shine, all over the jailhouse. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. I'm gonna let it shine. Well, this little light of mine, Lord, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. A few months ago, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was at a meeting in Boulder at Naropa Institute. And he heard, apparently for the first time, some music like that. And he saw, apparently for the first time, folks doing what we didn't do here, just up and moving to that music. And it was almost as if he was stunned. He just looked, and then we were sitting near each other. He turned around and looked at me as if to say, what is going on here? And then when he began to speak, he said, I didn't understand any of those words, but what I could see was that you all were very happy. And he said, that's the most important thing. We have come to the task of the Gandhi Hema King Center, trying to remember, not in nostalgia, but remember in terms of putting back together again, trying to remember how people could be happy in jail, how people could be happy under persecution, how people could be happy under the threat of losing their jobs and losing their lives. And this morning, we are helped in that process by the sister and brother who come from Youngstown, Ohio, to be with us. You will hear a fair amount about their history in the course of the interview conversation that we will be sharing together. But on a very personal note, I want to introduce them as my sister and brother, who I have known for 36 years. And as those with whom I share the privilege of walking through the places that Mrs. Hamer walked and singing the songs with Mrs. Hamer and knowing a little bit about what she meant when she said, all over the jailhouse, I'm going to let it shine. The Lynds and the Hardings met each other in Atlanta, Georgia in 1961 for the first time. We've continued since that time to try to meet each other and to remember and to encourage each other. I am very glad that they have come to encourage us and to be encouraged by us. They made that very clear last night at supper, that they were not coming simply as givers, but as seekers and receivers. And we'll hear more about that. And one of the first things that I would like us to give to them is, you know, our names and where we spent our childhood. And I won't threaten you with Ann Braden's audacity. She actually asked us to tell how old we were. Well, they're not that audacious because they weren't born in the South like Ann. But anything else that's close to that, you can tell. Maybe one of the nice things that you could do is to say, if you were alive, let's say in 1964, when Fannie Lou Hamer was singing that song, where were you? Alice was in Atlanta most of the time. Staughton was roaming around Mississippi. Where were you in the summer of 1964? Those three things would be very helpful. Your name, where you spent your childhood, and if you were alive, that is, if you had been physically born by that time, where did you spend the summer of 1964? Francisco, would you be the magic wand man for us, please? And for that honor, you have to start off.
My name is Francisco Maria. I spent my childhood in Angola, Southwest Africa, and in the summer of 1964, I wasn't born yet.
Okay.
My name is Chris Sigala, and during the 1964, I believe that I was in elementary going into junior high school here in North Denver. One of the most important things for me during that time and going to Horseman Middle School that's I went to is I had my first teacher of color. His name was Mr. Johnson, a black gentleman, so that always stood out in my mind.
My name is Gail Arisman Valletta, and I grew up mostly in Warrensburg, Missouri, but my first years were spent near Des Moines, Iowa, and 1964, I was anxiously waiting to go to kindergarten.
I'm Kay Grice, and I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, but in the summer of 1964, I was going in to be a junior in high school in Dallas, Texas.
Rose Trigg, I'm a native of Mississippi. My husband's going to speak first. We're a team.
All right. And you're the team member.
You've just
that
seen a
tells us what to
miracle
do.
happen, because typically she's the one who speaks for the team. In 1964, we were concluding 5 years of ministry in Mississippi. I was pastor on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and we were being invited to leave.
Whereabouts on
At Leggett Memorial Church in Biloxi.
Biloxi?
Yes. And one of those interesting years in which a lot of wonderful things happened in the church, and I was accused of destroying the church.
We did it together.
Yes, yes. And then that was the year we had to leave the state, and so I went to be the director of inner city ministries in Indianapolis that year.
Okay, tell us where you spent your childhood. Both Triggs.
Yes, now you go
Well,
back. and-
I'll have to, we're going to take just a minute. I'll brag on my dad, okay? My dad was a Methodist minister, so I grew up in Mississippi, and my dad was a minister at Galloway Memorial Methodist Church in Jackson, and was trying to make people realize what was going on. And he was right in the middle between the Freedom Riders and the local Mississippians, and the local people accused him of ruining the church. The Freedom Riders accused him of ruining the church, so I'm real proud of what my dad did during those years. Oh, and, well, so that's enough of that. We both grew up in Mississippi.
She grew up, obviously, as a PK all over North Mississippi in various cities, and I grew up in Clark County, Mississippi.
Okay. Thank you. And back of you.
My name is Michael Grady, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And I was a 2-year-old child in 1964.
Down the front here.
Well, I'm Chuck Cram. I grew up in Lamars, Iowa. And in 1964, I was 8 years old, in the 3rd grade, I think.
My name is Debbie Hull, and I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. And in '64, I was going into the 6th grade with my first male teacher.
I'm Carol Fine, and grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. And in 1964, I was in elementary school in Lincoln, Nebraska.
My name's Chris Schulman. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. And by the summer of '64, I was just finishing 1st grade in Houston, Texas, which is where I spent the rest of my childhood.
I'm Sharon Braun. I grew up in Rochester, Pennsylvania, just kind of across the river from Youngstown. And I was 12 in the summer of '64.
I'm Joe Wynn, and I grew up in Colorado Springs, and I graduated from high school in 1964. In the summer, I spent taking my first college course.
I'm Jane Hayes. I was raised in Jacksonville, Florida, and in the summer of '64, I moved from a tiny Kentucky town to Denver, and it was quite an interesting move, both exciting and disappointing in where the freedom movement was here.
I'm Joan Laurie, and I spent my childhood in Lubbock, Texas in 1964. In the summer, I turned 9.
My name is Ken Seaman, and I grew up in Long Island, New York. And in 1964, I was living in Chicago. That was approximately 2 years before I was radicalized by the Vietnam War and by the Civil Rights Movement.
My name is Mag Seaman. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. In the summer of '64, I was teaching at Webster College in a suburb right outside of St. Louis. And then shortly after that, I moved to Denver.
My name is Marai Tsontambar. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and '64 I just come into the world.
My name is Kiboko from Belgium, Congo. I spent my childhood in Belgium, Congo, and in summer of '64, my parents were running with us here and there because of civil wars.
My name is Janet Lynn Jackson. I spent my childhood in the Denver metro area, and I was born in 1970.
My name is Eric Obermeller. I spent my childhood in Colorado, Nebraska, and Ohio, up near Cleveland, and I was born in 1974.
My name is Kathy McCoy, and I grew up in the Florida Panhandle and Alabama, and I was 13 in 1964, living in Cantonment, Florida.
You friends who just came in, as you may be able to make out, we're trying to do a little introduction of ourselves to the Lynds. We're telling them our full name, where we spent our childhood, And having listened to Mrs. Hamer from Mississippi in 1964, we're saying something about where we were in the summer of 1964. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm Richard Krusch. I grew up in Michigan, and I was at Michigan State in 1964.
My name is Moises Rodriguez. I am from Nicaragua. I spent my childhood in a small town in the north named Esquilari, and I'm happy to be here.
We're very glad that you are here, dear brother. Very glad. We ask the recorders to be recorded. So go ahead.
My name is Brock Edwards, and I was born in Los Angeles, and I wasn't around in '64. I was born in '66.
My name is Jeff Hansel. I'm from Ohio. I spent my childhood in Springfield and Cincinnati, Ohio, and in 1964 I was 9 years old.
My name is Andy Newberg, and I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in '64, I was 8 years old.
Sudarshan, why don't you and I say just briefly a word in response to the questions, and then we'll let the Lynds come in as we get them to tell a bit of their story.
My name is Sudarshan Kapoor. I spent my childhood in northern India, and in 1964 I was a student in London, England.
My name is Vincent Gordon Harding, and I spent my childhood in Harlem and the South Bronx in New York. And there were many places that I could talk about in the summer of 1964. I'll just mention two. Early in that summer, I was in Oxford, Ohio, at the Women's College there, helping to train the women and men who were going down into Mississippi for Mississippi summer. And I got to the training session just after the three young men had left, never to return again. But I had known Mickey Schwerner before that in Meridian, Mississippi. Well, friends, thank you very much for speaking to us of who you are. Our ideal would be a day together to explore some of these stories, to hear about these church disturbers and their friends. But for now, we will have to be satisfied with the couple of hours that we have together here. And as you know, many of you, one of our major purposes in being together for the Gandhi Hamer King interviews is to try to understand through the lives of participants in pro-democracy movements. And I consider our freedom movement in the 60s one of the first of the 20th century's pro-democracy movements. We're trying to understand from participants in those movements in our country and in other parts of the world what was the role of religion in their life? How did it help to shape and form them? How did it help them to find their own sense of vocation, especially their engagement in pro-democratic social struggle? And of course, we always ask people to reflect on what all that means now. We'll start this morning with Staughton and Alice, and then we'll be with them again tomorrow morning at the Catholic Workers Soup Kitchen from 10 till 2. For any of you who would like to join us again, bring some lunch for yourself and for anybody else who looks hungry in here. And what we do there is to have the taped interviews from about 10 till noon, and then turn off the cameras and just have a free-flowing discussion over lunchtime before closing out. Before we start now, though, I have to make one of those announcements that get made in situations like this. Somebody has a green station wagon that is parked, as my friend said, inappropriately.
It's blocking somebody's handicap parking.
If that has any reference to anybody here, leap up as quickly as you can and go and move it. Dear friends, thank you for being here. Staughton and Alice, you came to Atlanta in 60 or 61, wasn't it? So we came to Atlanta in the same year. They came there because Staughton was going to be teaching history at Spelman College in Atlanta, one of the historic black colleges, as we were saying then, Negro colleges, and Staughton was on the faculty at Spelman. Alice was on the faculty of her children and doing quite a teaching job in that setting. And I was not yet teaching at Spelman when they came, but I met them because we were living in Atlanta doing the disturbing of the peace work that so many of our friends were doing, and also the reconciliation work that needed to be done as well. I'd like to start out with asking both of you, why would these two people who start out in the North in relatively privileged middle-class settings take it upon themselves at the very opening up of your career, Staughton, as a professional historian and academic? Why would you want to come to a black school in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1961?
He asked you.
I grew up in New York City, and I think there are two things about my childhood you might wish to know. The first is that I was the subject of a controlled experiment in the proposition that a child can be raised ethically without a theological basis.